Hello! Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Bible Story Children's Time. Glad you could make it. We are continuing to work our way through the Gospel of Luke right now. And the story I have today, there's actually a couple of related stories. They both have to do with the Sabbath. Now the Sabbath, to the Jewish culture back then, the Hebrew culture, the Sabbath was very important. It was, I won't say it was central to their religion, but it was something that was taken very seriously. And for an observant Jew in the first century, it was a time when no work was done. There were very, very strict limits about what kind of work, and work would be in quotes, could be done. Very little is the short version of that. And the Pharisees, who were a class of people who, at least outwardly, stuck very tightly to a strict interpretation of the law, they figure into these next couple of things that happen. So that's just a little bit of a brief background there. So what happens here is this is in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6. And if you remember in the last one, Jesus was already starting to kind of push the envelope a little bit by reaching out to people that were not supposed to be reached out to, which is not really a well-constructed sentence, but you know what I mean. He was reaching out to people that were social outcasts, social pariahs. They were people that no self-respecting first century Jew would want to be associating with. The first was the leper that he healed, who was unclean, and by touching him, Jesus risked becoming unclean as well. And the second one was Levi, the tax collector. Tax collectors were very widely hated back then, and not without good reason. They had flexible ethics. A lot of people didn't like them, and no self-respecting man of that time in that culture would associate with them willingly. And yet Jesus called one to follow him, to be a disciple, and Jesus also went and ate at his house along with other less desirable people. So Jesus is already starting to show that he's not really, really careful about following some of the social norms and laws. So that's where we are. On a Sabbath day after these last events that we talked about, Jesus was walking with his disciples, and they happened to be walking through a grain field. And his disciples happened to be hungry. So what they started doing is the disciples would pluck the heads of grain as they walked by and rub them in their hands until the chaff was worn away and they just had the kernels left, and then they were eating the kernels. And you and I would look at that and we would think, well, they're eating. We might be a little preoccupied that by the idea that they were taking somebody else's grain, but that wasn't the issue, interestingly enough. The issue that some Pharisees honed in on was that they said, hey, you need to stop that. It's the Sabbath. You're doing work. That's not lawful. So you need to stop plucking heads of grain and grinding them between your hands and then eating the kernels of grain. And Jesus hears this, and he says, dudes, don't you remember what it said in the book of Samuel? About David when he was on the run and he and his men were starving. Does that ring any bells? Do you remember what they did? Now, Luke doesn't go into it exactly. He goes into it in a little detail, but I'll give you a little more background. What that story that Jesus was referencing was about is that when David was on the run and hungry, and his men were hungry, they went to the tabernacle, which was the early predecessor of the temple. And they went inside and they talked the priests into giving them some of what was called the showbread. Because every week there would be 12 loaves of bread baked and they would be left on a table as an offering to God. And also they would be there as a reminder that God fed the Israelites in the wilderness, a reminder of God's grace and willingness to take care of them. And the idea was that these loaves of bread were supposed to sit there. It's a holy thing. They sit there for a week, and then after a week, the priests get to eat them. But because his men were hungry, David talked the priests into giving them some of that bread. And they ate it, which was technically not lawful. And then Jesus, referencing that, said, they were hungry, right? So what's the deal? My guys are hungry too. They're doing the same thing. And besides, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, Son of Man was Jesus referring to himself. And by saying Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus was saying that he actually ruled over the Sabbath. So he was making a pretty big claim there. And he was also making a pretty big claim for just disregarding some very dearly held beliefs about what was permissible and what wasn't on the Sabbath day. So keep that in mind. Then on another Sabbath, Jesus was preaching in the synagogue, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled, Luke says. It was probably paralyzed, either by illness or by an accident, and it was no longer, how it gets when the muscles are no longer working and it's just kind of shriveled and basically useless. And the Pharisees, also in the synagogue, saw this. And they thought, okay, this is going to be good. Because Jesus, that do-gooder bumpkin from Galilee, he likes to heal people. But here it is the Sabbath. And if he actually healed them, that would be doing work. So he shouldn't do that. So let's sit back and see what happens. Jesus knew what they were thinking. He was a bright guy. So he said to the man with the shriveled up hand, he said, why don't you get up here and stand in front of everyone so they can see what your hand is like? So he got up and he stood there. Then Jesus said to the Pharisees, the ones who had been whispering to themselves about, we got Jesus in a pickle now. He said to them, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy a life? It was the Pharisees' turn to be in a pickle. They didn't respond. So Jesus gave them a moment, and when there was no great wisdom forthcoming from the Pharisees, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And when the man stretched out his hand, it was completely healed and restored, and he could use it again. Now the Pharisees were furious because Jesus had done work. But Jesus had also done good. Not in the sense of doing something well, but he had done a good thing. So actually he was following, and this was Jesus' point, he was following a higher law. Even though the law might say to rest on the Sabbath, if the opportunity to do something good comes along and you can do it and it happens to be the Sabbath, do good. And that was the lesson Jesus was trying to teach the Pharisees, and they sort of understood it. They understood it well enough to know that they had sort of been tricked and outfoxed on the whole legality issue. And they also understood it well enough to know that this Jesus character was dangerous. He was dangerous to them as leaders, because if people start listening to him, that means they stop listening to them. And they also knew that Jesus was dangerous because he was setting himself up either above or at least parallel to the law. And the Pharisees were the arbiters of the law in first century Israel. And if Jesus was going to come along and start acting this way, then that made him a very, very dangerous man. And something would have to be done about him. So they started talking to each other about what they could do to deal with this problem called Jesus. And that's where our story ends today. We'll see you back here tomorrow, Thursday, 5 o'clock, for another story from the Gospel of Luke. But in the meantime, stay safe and have a great evening.